On a frigid February morning in 2002, in the quiet farming town of Cottonwood, Minnesota, a woman named Catherine Lindstrom walked into the Lyon County Sheriff's office carrying a burden she had held for 20 years. Her hands trembled as she placed a manila folder on the desk. Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and a single photograph of a girl who had vanished when the snow was deep and the silence was deeper. The deputy who took her statement would later say that Catherine's voice never rose above a whisper, but her words would crack open a case that had haunted this community since the winter of 1982. 20 years of silence, 20 years of a family fractured beyond recognition. And at the center of it all, a question that had never been answered. What happened to 9-year-old Sarah Engstrom on the afternoon of February 12, 1982, when she walked out of her elementary school and disappeared into the white expanse of a Minnesota winter? Cottonwood sits in the southwestern corner of Minnesota, where the prairie stretches flat and endless beneath a sky that seems too large for the land below. In winter, the town becomes a study in monochrome. White fields meet gray horizons. The wind comes sharp across the open ground, carrying snow that stings exposed skin and piles in drifts against the aluminum-sided houses that line the residential streets. Population in 1982, just under 1,200 souls. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where doors are left unlocked, where children walk to school without supervision because nothing bad ever happens here. The Engstrom family lived on Maple Street in a modest 2-story house with green shutters and a chain-link fence around the backyard. James Engstrom, 34, worked as a mechanic at the John Deere dealership on Highway 14. His wife, Linda, 32, kept the home and worked part-time at the public library. Their daughter Sarah was their only child, a 4th grader at Cottonwood Elementary with blonde hair she wore in 2 braids and a gap between her front teeth that showed when she smiled. Those who knew her said she loved horses, though she had never ridden one. She drew pictures of them constantly, filling notebook after notebook with sketches of wild Mustangs and spotted Pintos. February 12, 1982 began like any other winter Friday. The temperature at dawn was 8 degrees below zero. The sky was overcast, that particular flat gray that promises more snow. Linda Engstrom woke Sarah at 7:15, as she did every school morning. Sarah ate Cheerios with sliced bananas for breakfast. She wore her blue winter coat with the fur-lined hood, her red mittens, her snow boots with the white laces. Linda would later remember every detail with painful precision. The way Sarah complained that her boots were too tight. The way she had to remind her daughter twice to brush her teeth. The kiss on the forehead as Sarah headed out the door at 8:05. Cottonwood Elementary sat 6 blocks from the Engstrom house. Sarah walked the same route every day, down Maple to 3rd Street, left on 3rd to Oak, right on Oak until she reached the school's front entrance. Other children walked the same streets, a small parade of bright coats against the snow. Sarah's best friend, Jennifer Martinez, lived 4 houses down and usually walked with her, but Jennifer had stayed home that day with a fever, so Sarah walked alone. Clear's throat. School proceeded normally. Sarah's 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Helen Korngold, would later tell investigators that Sarah seemed no different than usual. She participated in the social studies lesson about state capitals. She ate her packed lunch, turkey sandwich and an apple, in the cafeteria at 11:45. During afternoon recess at 1:30, several classmates saw her playing on the monkey bars. When the bell rang at 3:15, marking the end of the school day, Sarah gathered her backpack and her library book and filed out with the other students through the main doors. The temperature had risen to 23 degrees. The clouds had broken slightly, allowing thin winter sunlight to angle across the packed snow. Parents in cars lined up in the circular drive in front of the school. Children scattered in all directions, some toward waiting vehicles, others beginning the walk home. The crossing guard, retired postal worker Bernard Hoffman, stood at his usual post at the corner of Oak and 5th Street. He would later state that he saw Sarah leave the building. He remembered her red mitten specifically. He watched her turn right on Oak Street, heading in the direction of home. That was the last confirmed sighting of Sarah Engstrom. She never arrived home. At 3:45, Linda Engstrom glanced at the kitchen clock and felt the first flutter of concern. Sarah was usually home by 3:35 at the latest. By 4 o'clock, that flutter had become something sharper. Linda put on her coat and walked the route to school, thinking perhaps Sarah had stopped to play with a friend, though she knew Sarah had been instructed never to do that without calling first. The streets were empty. The school was locked. Linda's breath came faster in the cold air. At 4:20, she called James at work. By 4:30, James had arrived home and they had both retraced Sarah's route, calling her name, knocking on doors. The Martinez family had not seen her. Neither had the Johnsons or the Petersons. At 4:45, James Engstrom called the Lyon County Sheriff's Office. Deputy Thomas Keller arrived at the Engstrom house at 5:03. He took down the initial report. Female child, 9 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, last seen wearing blue coat, red mittens, jeans, white snow boots. Missing approximately 1 hour and 45 minutes. He radioed for additional units. By 5:30, 4 deputies were driving slowly through Cottonwood streets, searchlights sweeping across yards and alleys. Volunteers from the community began arriving at the Engstrom house, organizing themselves into search teams. The fire department brought equipment. The temperature was dropping again as the sun set at 5:52. They searched through the night. Flashlight beams swept through the bare branches of trees. Dogs were brought in, tracking through backyards and vacant lots. The searches expanded outward in concentric circles from the school, covering the downtown business district, the cemetery, the abandoned grain elevator at the edge of town. They checked every garage, every shed, every parked car. The railroad tracks that ran parallel to Highway 14 were walked in both directions for miles. The frozen creek bed that wound through the south side of town was examined inch by inch. By morning, Sarah Engstrom had been missing for 15 hours. The February dawn came gray and cold. The swing set in the Engstrom backyard hung motionless. Inside the house, Linda Engstrom sat at the kitchen table, still wearing the same clothes from the previous day, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she had not drunk. James stood at the window, looking out at the street where deputies continued to canvass the neighborhood, asking the same questions over and over. Had anyone seen Sarah after school? Had anyone noticed anything unusual? Had anyone heard or seen anything at all? The answer from every house on every street was the same. No, no one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. Sarah Engstrom had simply vanished. Part 2. The Investigation. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension arrived in Cottonwood on February 13th. Special Agent Donald Kruger took command of the investigation, setting up a command post in the community center. Maps were taped to the walls. Photographs of Sarah were duplicated and distributed. A timeline was constructed on a large whiteboard, accounting for every minute of Sarah's last known day. Volunteers continued to arrive, more than 200 by the end of the second day, organized into grid search patterns that covered the surrounding farmland square mile by square mile. The media descended. Television crews from Minneapolis and Sioux Falls set up in the high school parking lot. Reporters interviewed neighbors, teachers, anyone who might have known Sarah or seen something relevant. Linda and James Engstrom appeared at a press conference on February 14th, standing before a wall of microphones and cameras. Linda read a prepared statement, her voice breaking repeatedly. James stood beside her, his face pale and drawn, his jaw set. He said nothing. The footage would be replayed on news broadcasts throughout the region for days. Clears throat. Investigators began the painstaking work of reconstructing Sarah's movements and examining every possible lead. The route from school to home was measured precisely, 6 blocks, approximately half a mile. Walking time for a 9-year-old child, 12 to 15 minutes. Sarah left school at approximately 3:16. She should have arrived home no later than 3:31. She did not. Somewhere in those 15 minutes on those 6 blocks of familiar streets, something had happened. Deputies interviewed every resident along the route, every window that faced the street, every person who might have been home that afternoon. The responses were frustratingly uniform. Most people had been inside, staying warm. Several had been at work. Those who had been home had not been watching the street. It was an ordinary Friday afternoon. Children walked home from school every day. Why would anyone have been paying attention? The crossing guard, Bernard Hoffman, was interviewed multiple times. He provided the last confirmed sighting. He described seeing Sarah turn right on Oak Street at approximately 3:17. His attention had then shifted to other children crossing at his intersection. He had not watched Sarah walk away. He assumed, as anyone would have, that she was walking home, that she was safe. Physical evidence was scarce to the point of absence. The snow on the sidewalks and streets had been packed down by foot traffic and car tires. There were no clear footprints to follow, no signs of a struggle, no dropped items, no disturbance of any kind. Sarah's library book was not found. Her backpack was not found. It was as though she had been lifted out of the world between one footstep and the next. Investigators turned their attention to registered offenders in the area. There were 3 within a 50-mile radius. All were interviewed and their whereabouts on February 12th were documented. All had alibis that checked out. Background checks were run on every adult who had regular contact with Sarah. Teachers, coaches, neighbors, family, friends. Nothing raised red flags. The search expanded. State police helicopter flew grid patterns over the farmland. Divers were brought in to check stock ponds and the portions of the creek that had not frozen solid. Abandoned farm buildings were examined. Every vehicle that had been seen in or near Cottonwood on February 12th was identified and its driver interviewed. Truckers who regularly drove Highway 14 were contacted. Nothing led anywhere. But there were inconsistencies, small things that did not fit together cleanly. Those who knew the Engstrom family began to notice them, though few spoke openly about their observations at first. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about the father, James. His demeanor seemed off to some of them, too controlled, too calm. While Linda dissolved into visible anguish, James remained stoic, almost blank. He answered questions in a flat monotone. He did not cry, at least not where others could see. When he appeared at the press conference, several reporters noted that he seemed almost detached, as though he were watching events unfold from a great distance. On February 16th, 4 days after Sarah's disappearance, James Engstrom was asked to come to the sheriff's office for another interview. This was described as routine, a chance to go over the timeline again, to see if he might remember any additional details that could help. James agreed. The interview was conducted by Agent Kruger and Sheriff Martin Oakes. It lasted 3 hours. During this interview, James was asked about his movements on February 12th. He had been at work at the dealership until approximately 4:15 when Linda called. He had then driven directly home. The dealership was on Highway 14, approximately 2 miles from his house. Drive time, less than 5 minutes. His coworkers confirmed he had been at work throughout the afternoon. His time card showed him clocking in at 7:58 that morning and not clocking out until 4:17. But there was a gap, a detail that did not quite align. James had taken his lunch break from 12:15 to 1 o'clock. He stated he had driven home for lunch, something he did routinely. Linda confirmed this. She said he had arrived home at approximately 12:20 and left again around 12:55. That gave him 10 minutes of travel time, 20 minutes at home. It fit. Except that the odometer reading on James's truck, a 1979 Ford F-150, showed he had driven 18 miles between the morning of February 12th and the evening of February 13th. The round trip from the dealership to his house and back was 4 miles. Adding the drive home after Sarah disappeared and the subsequent driving around town searching added perhaps another 6 miles. That left 8 miles unaccounted for. When asked about this, James said he had driven around during his lunch break, thinking about some repairs that needed to be done on a customer's tractor. He had driven out toward the county road just to clear his head. He sometimes did that. It was plausible. It was even ordinary. But it was also impossible to verify. And in the context of a missing child investigation, every unexplained detail took on weight. Investigators began to look more closely at James Engstrom. His background was examined. He had grown up in Cottonwood, graduated from the high school in 1966, served briefly in the Army, returned home and married Linda in 1972. He had no criminal record, not even a traffic ticket. He was described by everyone who knew him as quiet, hardworking, reliable, a good father, a good husband. The kind of man who kept to himself, but could be counted on to help a neighbor fix a fence or jumpstart a car. But quiet can mean different things. Several people who knew James mentioned that he was difficult to read, that he did not share his feelings, that there was something closed off about him. One coworker at the dealership said, quote, "Jim was always friendly enough, but I never felt like I really knew him. He would listen to you talk, but he never talked much himself. You could work beside him all day and not know what he was thinking." On February 19th, 1 week after Sarah's disappearance, investigators executed a search warrant on the Engstrom home and James's truck. The search was thorough. Every room was examined. Every closet, every drawer, every box in the basement. The truck was taken to the crime lab in St. Paul for detailed forensic examination. Samples were collected. Fibers, hair, soil from the floor mats, material from the truck bed. Nothing was found. No blood, no sign of a struggle, no physical evidence linking James or his vehicle to Sarah's disappearance. The results were documented and filed. The investigation continued, but the initial momentum was fading. Leads dried up. Tips that had poured in during the first days slowed to a trickle. By March, the searchers had covered hundreds of square miles. The ground was frozen too hard to dig. The waiting began. Linda Engstrom gave interviews to anyone who would listen, pleading for information, begging whoever had taken her daughter to bring her home. James stopped appearing in public. He returned to work, kept his head down, said nothing. Those who saw him said he looked older, his face lined with new creases, his eyes hollow. The community divided itself into those who felt sympathy for a family in agony and those who felt something else. Something unspoken but heavy. Doubt. Suspicion. The sense that there were questions no one wanted to ask out loud. By summer, the Sarah Engstrom case had gone cold. The FBI had been consulted. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had been contacted. Sarah's photograph was distributed nationwide. Months passed. Then a year. Then 2. The silence deepened. The case file remained open but inactive. And in Cottonwood, life moved forward, carrying with it the weight of an unanswered question that never quite faded. Part 3. The Silence. In the spring of 1984, 2 years after Sarah vanished, James and Linda Engstrom sold their house on Maple Street and moved to a rental property on the outskirts of town. The house with the green shutters, where Sarah had eaten breakfast and drawn pictures of horses, where her bedroom remained exactly as she had left it, became unbearable. Every room held her presence. Every corner whispered her absence. The swing set in the backyard became a monument to emptiness. Linda could not look at it. The marriage, already fractured by grief, began to crumble under the weight of things that could not be said. Those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt suspicion crawling into a relationship like frost creeping across glass, know that once it enters, it changes everything. Linda never accused James directly. She never said the words out loud. But the questions lived in the spaces between their conversations, in the way she watched him when he came home from work, in the way she flinched when he touched her, in the nightmares that woke her gasping, dreams she could not remember but which left her staring at the ceiling until dawn, afraid to close her eyes again. James felt it, the withdrawal, the distance. He tried, in his quiet way, to bridge the gap. He worked longer hours, as though providing for them might somehow prove what words could not. He came home exhausted and ate dinner in silence. He fell asleep in his chair in front of the television, the blue light flickering across his face. Linda would watch him from the kitchen doorway and wonder what he was dreaming about. Wonder if he was capable of the things she sometimes, in her darkest moments, suspected him of. They did not speak Sarah's name, not to each other. It was too painful, too dangerous. The subject sat between them like a live wire. If they touched it, everything would explode. So they built their lives around its absence, carving out territories of silence, existing in the same house but living increasingly separate lives. Clear's throat. In 1986, Linda began seeing a therapist in Marshall, the county seat 20 miles away. She drove there every Tuesday evening, telling James she was going to the library or the grocery store. She needed to talk to someone. She needed to say the things she could not say at home. During those sessions, she talked about Sarah, about the guilt that consumed her, about the belief that she should have driven her daughter to school that morning, should have walked her home, should have been watching the street from the window. She talked about her husband, about the distance, about the doubts she tried to suppress but which grew stronger with each passing year. The therapist asked careful questions. Had James ever shown any warning signs before Sarah's disappearance? Had he ever been inappropriate with their daughter? Had there been any indication of violence or instability? Linda said no, insisted no. James had been a good father. He had never raised his hand to Sarah, never raised his voice. He had played with her, had helped her with homework, had tucked her in at night. He had been normal, ordinary. So why could Linda not shake the feeling that something was wrong? Why did she lie awake at night, replaying that lunch hour on February 12th, wondering where James had really gone during those extra miles on his odometer? For those who have ever been trapped in this particular torture, this living with someone you both love and fear, you understand that it becomes a form of suffocation. Linda felt herself drowning slowly, day by day. She gained weight, then lost it. She stopped caring about her appearance. She quit her job at the library because she could not bear the sympathetic looks, the careful questions, the way people's voices changed when they talked to her. She became a ghost in her own life. And then in the summer of 1987, something broke. Linda cannot remember exactly what triggered it. Perhaps it was nothing specific. Perhaps it was simply the accumulation of 5 years of silence becoming too heavy to bear. They were sitting at the dinner table, eating pot roast that neither of them tasted. James asked her to pass the salt. She looked at him and said, "Did you do something to her?" The words fell into the room like stones into still water. James stopped chewing. He set down his fork. His face went pale, then flushed dark red. He stood up so abruptly his chair fell backward. He did not shout, James never shouted, but his voice when he spoke was cold and hard as iron. "How can you ask me that? How can you even think that?" Linda started to cry. I don't know what to think. The police looked at you. They searched everything. Why did they do that if they didn't suspect you?" "Because they suspect everyone. That's what they do, but you're my wife. You're supposed to know me. You're supposed to trust me." "I did trust you, I do. But James, she's gone. Our daughter is gone and you act like nothing happened. You don't talk about her. You don't cry. You just go to work and come home and it's like she never existed." "That's not fair. None of this is fair." They stood on opposite sides of the table, the distance between them suddenly unbridgeable. James picked up his chair, set it upright, walked out of the house. He did not come back until after midnight. Linda did not ask where he had been. They never spoke of that conversation again, but something had been said that could not be unsaid. The marriage was over in everything but name. In October 1987, Linda moved out. She rented a small apartment above the hardware store in downtown Cottonwood. James remained in the rental house. They did not divorce immediately. That took another 2 years, finalized in 1989. The legal documents listed irreconcilable differences. Linda told no one about her suspicions. She could not prove anything. She had no evidence. Only doubt, which poisoned everything but proved nothing. James continued working at the dealership. He became more reclusive, more closed off. His coworkers gave him space. The town gave him space. Whether that space was born of sympathy or suspicion was unclear. Perhaps both. He lived alone. He drank alone. On the anniversary of Sarah's disappearance each February, he would drive out to the cemetery and stand at the empty memorial stone Linda had placed there, a small granite marker with Sarah's name and the words, "Forever in our hearts." He would stand there for an hour, unmoving, then drive home. Catherine Lindstrom, Linda's younger sister, watched all of this unfold from a distance. Catherine had moved to Minneapolis in 1980 to attend college and had stayed there, building a life and career. She had remained close with Linda, talking on the phone weekly, visiting when she could. She had watched her sister disintegrate. She had listened to the doubts, the fears, the agonized questions that had no answers, and she had made a promise to herself. If she ever learned anything, anything at all that might bring answers, she would not remain silent. The years passed. The 90s came and went. Sarah Engstrom's case remained open but dormant. The original investigators retired. New deputies who had not been there in 1982 took their places. The case file gathered dust in the evidence room. James Engstrom continued his quiet, solitary existence. Linda remarried in 1995 to a kind man from Marshall who had never known Sarah, who could offer her a life unburdened by the past. Catherine built her career, rose through the ranks at the marketing firm where she worked, had children of her own. But she never forgot, and she never stopped paying attention. In January 2002, Catherine's son, who was 15, came home from school upset. He had been assigned a project about unsolved mysteries for his history class. While researching online, he had stumbled across a website about missing children. One of the cases featured was Sarah Engstrom. Catherine's nephew had never known about his cousin. Linda had never told her children about Sarah, wanting to spare them the shadow of that tragedy. But now it had found them anyway. Catherine's son asked questions. Catherine answered. And in answering, she began to think about all the years that had passed, all the silence, all the unanswered questions. He called Linda. They talked for 3 hours. Linda told her sister something she had never revealed before. In 1995, shortly before her remarriage, Linda had gone to James's house. She had wanted to retrieve some old photo albums, pictures of Sarah that she could not bear to leave behind. James was not home. Linda used her old key, which still worked. She went inside, found the albums in the basement, and she found something else. A box pushed far back on a high shelf covered with dust. Inside the box were Sarah's belongings, her backpack, her library book, her red mittens. Linda had taken nothing. She had left everything exactly as she found it. She had locked the door behind her and driven away and never told anyone. Because what did it prove? James had kept his daughter's things. Perhaps that was normal for a grieving father. Perhaps it was evidence of something else. Linda had not known then, and she did not know now. But Catherine knew that this information needed to be shared. She thought about it for 3 weeks. She consulted a lawyer, asking hypothetical questions about statute of limitations, about what constituted evidence, about whether after 20 years anything could be done. And then, on February 11th, 2002, the day before the 20th anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, Catherine made her decision. Part 4. The Revelation. Clears throat. Catherine Lindstrom walked into the Lyon County Sheriff's Office on the morning of February 11th, 2002, carrying her manila folder of documentation and the terrible knowledge that had lived in her family for 7 years. She asked to speak to someone about the Sarah Engstrom case. The young deputy at the front desk did not recognize the name immediately. He had been 10 years old in 1982. But he looked it up in the system, saw the open case file, and called for his supervisor. Deputy Chief Robert Stenson, who had been a rookie deputy in 1982 and remembered the case vividly, sat down with Catherine in an interview room. She told him everything, about Linda's suspicions, about the odometer discrepancy that had never been explained, about the way James had shut down emotionally, about the box Linda had found in 1995. Stenson listened without interrupting. When Catherine finished, he asked if Linda would be willing to make a formal statement. Catherine said she would ask her. Linda Engstrom, now Linda Hoffman, came to the sheriff's office 2 days later, on February 13th. She was 52 years old, her blonde hair now streaked with gray, her face lined with 20 years of grief. She sat in the same interview room where her ex-husband had been questioned 2 decades earlier and told investigators about the box, about finding Sarah's backpack and mittens in James's basement, about never reporting it because she had not known what it meant and had been afraid to find out. The case, dormant for so long, lurched back to life. A new warrant was obtained. On February 20th, 2002, investigators returned to James Engstrom's house. He was at work. They searched the basement methodically. The box Linda described was no longer on the high shelf, but they found it eventually pushed into a crawl space behind the furnace. Inside were the items Linda had seen: a small blue backpack with rainbow patches sewn on by a 9-year-old's careful hands, a library book, Island of the Blue Dolphins, 20 years overdue, a pair of red mittens child-sized, the yarn frayed at the thumbs. James Engstrom was brought in for questioning that same afternoon. He was 54 years old now, his hair completely gray, his frame thinner than it had been. He sat across from Deputy Chief Stenson and Agent Mark Haverson from the BCA, who had been assigned to review cold cases and had taken over the Engstrom file. They asked him about the items. Why did he have them? Where had he found them? James said nothing for 45 minutes. He sat with his hands folded on the table, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over the investigator's shoulders. Then finally he spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I found them, that day, after." The recording of that interview would later be played in court. The exact words were these: "I was driving around during lunch. Like I told you before, I was out by the county road, and I saw them just lying there in the ditch, the backpack and the mittens. I stopped. I picked them up. I didn't know what to do. If I brought them in, everyone would ask where I found them. Everyone would wonder why I was out there, why I found them and nobody else did. I was scared. I thought you would think I did something, so I kept them." I kept them and I didn't tell anyone, and I know that was wrong, but I didn't hurt her. I swear I didn't hurt my daughter." The investigators asked the obvious question. If he had found these items in a ditch, why was there no soil on them, no weathering, no indication they had been exposed to the elements? Why did the backpack still smell faintly of the fabric softener Linda Engstrom had used in 1982? James had no answer for that. He put his head in his hands. He started to cry, 20 years of held-back tears finally breaking through. But tears were not evidence. The items were sent for analysis. DNA technology had advanced considerably since 1982. Samples were taken from the mittens, from the backpack straps, from the book. They found Sarah's DNA, which was expected. They found Linda's DNA, also expected. And they found DNA from an unknown male, not James. The profile did not match him. It matched no one in any database. The revelation was staggering. For 20 years, suspicion had quietly shadowed James Engstrom. For 20 years, he had lived under that cloud. And the DNA evidence suggested that whoever had taken Sarah Engstrom, whoever had removed her mittens and handled her belongings, it had not been her father. But that raised new questions. Why had James not reported finding these items? His explanation that he feared suspicion falling on him was understandable in retrospect, but it had resulted in critical evidence being hidden for 2 decades, evidence that might have led to answers much sooner. The DNA profile was entered into every available database. Investigators began the process of checking it against known offenders, against anyone who might have been in southwestern Minnesota in February 1982. While this was happening, the community of Cottonwood learned that the case had been reopened. The local newspaper ran a front-page story. Television stations from Minneapolis sent reporters. The attention that had focused so intensely on the town 20 years earlier returned. James Engstrom did not leave his house. His phone rang constantly. He did not answer. When reporters knocked on his door, he stayed silent inside. Linda Hoffman learned about the DNA evidence from Deputy Chief Stinson. She sat in her living room in Marshall, her current husband beside her, and tried to process what she was being told. For so many years she had doubted. She had suspected. She had destroyed her marriage because of those doubts, and now it seemed those doubts had been misplaced. James had not harmed Sarah. Someone else had. Some unknown person whose genetic material told a story but provided no name. "I destroyed him," Linda said to the deputy chief, tears streaming down her face. "I destroyed both of us for nothing." Stinson said gently, "You didn't know. None of us knew." Clear's throat. The investigation moved forward with renewed energy. The unknown DNA profile became the focus. Investigators began systematically collecting DNA samples from individuals who had lived in or passed through Cottonwood in 1982. Former residents who had moved away were contacted. Truck drivers who had regularly driven Highway 14 were tracked down. It was painstaking work, made more difficult by the passage of time. People had died, moved, disappeared themselves. Records from 20 years earlier were incomplete. But then, in May 2002, there was a break. A man named Carl Hendricks, age 56, was arrested in Sioux City, Iowa, on an unrelated charge. As part of the booking process, his DNA was collected and entered into the system. It matched the unknown profile from Sarah Engstrom's belongings. Carl Hendricks. The name meant nothing to investigators initially. Background checks revealed he had grown up in Worthington, Minnesota, about 40 miles from Cottonwood. He had worked various jobs throughout his life: construction, factory work, long-haul trucking. He had a minor criminal record: petty theft in 1979, disorderly conduct in 1985, nothing violent, nothing involving children. He had moved around the Midwest, never staying in one place for long. In 1982, he had been living in Marshall, Minnesota, just 20 miles from Cottonwood. Hendricks was interviewed while in custody in Iowa. Agents Haverson and Stinson traveled to Sioux City to conduct the interview personally. Hendricks was shown Sarah's photograph. He claimed not to recognize her. He was asked about his whereabouts on February 12, 1982. He said he could not remember. That was 20 years ago. Who could remember a random day from 20 years ago? The agents explained about the DNA evidence. Hendricks became agitated. He said there must be some mistake. He had never been to Cottonwood. He had never hurt any child. But when pressed about whether he had ever been in Cottonwood, ever driven through it, ever stopped there for any reason, his story began to change. He admitted he might have driven through at some point. It was a small town on a highway. He drove through lots of small towns. That didn't mean anything. The agents asked about his vehicle in 1982. Hendricks said he had driven a green Dodge van. He had used it for work, hauling equipment for a construction company. The van was long gone, sold for scrap years ago. No way to examine it now. But witness statements from 1982 were reviewed. Several people had mentioned seeing an unfamiliar green van parked near the elementary school on February 12th. At the time, investigators had tried to track down the vehicle but had never identified it. Now, 20 years later, they had a possible match. On June 14, 2002, Carl Hendricks was formally charged with abduction and murder in the death of Sarah Engstrom. The murder charge was based on the legal presumption that a child missing for this length of time was deceased, though Sarah's body had never been found. Hendricks was extradited to Minnesota. He pleaded not guilty. The trial took place in the fall of 2003, more than 21 years after Sarah's disappearance. The courtroom in Marshall was packed every day. Linda Hoffman attended every session, sitting in the front row behind the prosecution table. James Engstrom attended as well, sitting alone in the back of the courtroom. They did not speak to each other. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the DNA evidence. Expert witnesses explained how genetic material from Hendricks had been found on Sarah's belongings. The probability of the DNA belonging to someone other than Hendricks was calculated at 1 in several billion. The defense argued that the presence of DNA on the items did not prove Hendricks had abducted or harmed Sarah. Perhaps he had touched her backpack innocently at some point. Perhaps there was contamination. Perhaps the evidence had been compromised during the 20 years it sat in James Engstrom's basement. James was called as a witness. He testified about finding the items, about keeping them, about his reasons for not coming forward. He appeared frail on the stand, his voice often breaking. Under cross-examination, the defense attorney tried to suggest that James himself might have been involved, that the investigation in 1982 had focused on him for good reason. The prosecutor objected repeatedly. The judge sustained most of the objections. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On October 23, 2003, they returned a verdict: guilty on the charge of abduction. Unable to reach a unanimous decision on the murder charge due to the absence of a body and direct evidence of death. Hendricks was sentenced to 30 years in prison for the abduction conviction. Outside the courthouse, Linda Hoffman stood before news cameras and read a brief statement. For 21 years, we have lived without answers. We have lived with suspicion and doubt and pain that never ended. Today, we have some measure of justice, though it cannot bring Sarah back. It cannot return the years we lost. But perhaps now she can rest. Perhaps now we all can. James Engstrom did not make a statement. He left the courthouse through a side door and drove back to Cottonwood alone. Closing. The arrest of Carl Hendricks closed the official investigation into Sarah Engstrom's disappearance, but it did not answer every question. Sarah's remains were never located, despite extensive searches prompted by Hendrix's conviction. He has never confessed. He maintains his innocence to this day, claiming the DNA evidence was somehow planted or contaminated. No appeals court has agreed with him. James Engstrom died in 2018 at the age of 70. His obituary was brief, mentioning his years at the dealership and his surviving family. It did not mention Sarah, though everyone who read it thought of her. Linda Hoffman, now 74, still lives in Marshall. She has photographs of Sarah on her mantle, a 9-year-old girl frozen forever in time, smiling with a gap between her front teeth, dreaming of horses she would never ride. For those who were there in Cottonwood in 1982, who searched through that long frozen night, who lived with the mystery for 20 years, the resolution brought complicated emotions. Relief that someone had been held accountable. Sorrow that it had taken so long. Guilt, perhaps, that suspicion had fallen on an innocent man who loved his daughter and spent 2 decades carrying not only grief, but the burden of doubt from those who should have believed in him. Justice, when it finally comes, does not erase the years of waiting. It does not heal what was broken, but it matters. It matters to the memory of a child who deserved better. It matters to a family that never stopped searching for truth. It matters because Sarah Engstrom mattered. She still does. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.